Welcome, everyone. My name is Tom McCarthy. I'm the president of the Bay Ridge Historical Society. I would like to welcome you to our meeting this evening. Tonight, we're honored to have Miriam Sicherman. Is that correct, Miriam?
Sicherman.
Fisherman come to speak to us on her book, Brooklyn's Barren Island, A Forgotten History. Just give you a little quick lead in on it. It's a swampy speck in Jamaica Bay where a motley collection of new immigrants and African Americans quietly processed mountains of garbage and dead animals starting in the 1850s until their eviction in 1936 by Robert Moses. Today, it is part of Floyd Bennett Field. So it looks to be a very interesting presentation. We're excited to have Miriam join us. On that note, I'll turn it over to Miriam, and thank you very much, Miriam. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Tom. And I'm really excited to be able to talk about my book tonight. And I really appreciate the Bay Ridge Historical Society for giving me this opportunity. And I've kind of changed the way I start my book talks since the pandemic started, because I'd like to share an anecdote that relates to what we're going through now. So I'm going to start my slideshow, and this is just sort of a typical view of Barren Island, but I'm going to first start by showing you one of my personal heroes, Jane F. Shaw. And she, I'm going to describe her work on Barren Island in more detail later, but she was, in short, a New York City public school teacher on the Lower East Side when she was recruited to work in the only school on Barren Island, PS 120, in 1918. So the Spanish flu pandemic was going on at the time. There was no medical care on the island. There never had been, and there never would be. And Shaw and the other teachers organized milk delivery and other services to provide for the health of the islanders. And at the same time, meanwhile, there was a new school custodian who had been assigned to the island against his will. His name was Noah Decker. He was very, very upset to be assigned to Barren Island, which, as you'll see in a moment, was very remote, far from his family on Staten Island. But when he saw Jane Shaw and the other teachers kind of rise to the occasion of this pandemic and create services that the islanders really needed, he was incredibly inspired. And he ended up staying on Barren Island for the whole rest of his life of his own volition. And he became like a real community leader as well. And he organized a volunteer fire company because there was no fire service from the city. He taught children classes about wireless radio technology, in addition to his basic job, which was keeping the school building clean. So I find those stories inspiring myself. And since we're going through our own pandemic right now, I just want to take this opportunity to thank everyone who is helping, whether it's the grocery store workers or the vaccine researchers or anyone else who is contributing to the general welfare during our pandemic. Because without them and without people like Jane Shaw and Noah Decker, this time, which is hard, would be much harder. So to go back to
before you get started, somebody's turning paper. It's if anyone's not speaking, if they could put themselves on mute, and any of the panelists, that would help. Thanks.
Okay. So before I read from the book, I'm going to kind of give you a little mini history of Barren Island, where it was, why I think it's interesting, so that the parts that I read from the book will make more sense. So in a nutshell, it's where a lot of the city's garbage and dead animals were processed and converted into useful products from the 1850s until the 1930s. There was a community on the island of these workers who were almost all immigrants and African Americans and their families. And in my opinion, the community is really fascinating and it had never really been studied before. So that's what I focus my book on. And by the way, some of the photos you'll see like this one are in my book, but some are not because they were not high resolution enough or I couldn't get the rights to them. So there's some photos in here that you might not be able to see elsewhere. So where was Barren Island? This is a map of obviously the New York metro area. This is from about 1900, which is 2 years after the 5 boroughs consolidated into New York City. So you can see, I've pointed out Barren Island here and Canarsie, and I'll explain that in a minute here. It doesn't look particularly remote on this map, but what you have to understand, and what another map I'll show you will show in more clearly, is this whole area. I think you can see my cursor. This whole area was just marsh. It was really hard to get to. You couldn't just necessarily row a boat from a much closer part of Brooklyn to Barren Island because it was so swampy. Rather, you would have to take a ferry from Canarsie because the water was it was easier to navigate, even though it was quite a bit further away than other parts of Brooklyn. So, so if you lived on Barren Island, that was your connection to the rest of the city, was the ferry all the way over here to Canarsie. Originally, quite small on the screen, but I'll try and explain it. This is the town of Flatlands. This map is from 1873. So Flatlands, as probably a lot of people at this meeting already know, was one of the original 6 towns that became Brooklyn. It was settled in the late 1600s by the Dutch. And at the time it was called New Amersfoort. And it became part of the city of Brooklyn in 1896. And then 2 years later, Brooklyn became part of New York City. So until 1896, it was its own independent town. Barren Island is down at the bottom of this map. I don't know if you can make out the print. It's pretty blurry. But this is Barren Island here. And you can see this whole area is this sort of swamp, marshy area that you wouldn't be able to just, take a boat from Flatlands proper to Barren Island. The name, by the way, comes from the Dutch Bear Island. I don't know if there ever were bears there, but it doesn't come from the meaning barren in English. You can, by the way, to just orient you, this is Flatbush Avenue here, which, as you can see, stopped like well before Barren Island in 1873. So the island itself, this is what it looked like in 1899, and I've marked this sort of chunk of land. It's a little hard to read on here, so I labeled it New York City owned land. Ultimately, the city, by the time everyone was evicted in 1936, the city owned almost all of the island, so that the people who lived there were tenants of the city. They rented the land and then they owned their houses that they built on the land. This area over here, it says, I don't know if you can read it, it says Thomas F. White. The White family owned one of the garbage factories, and they did continue to own some of the island privately. And so when everyone was evicted, a few people moved to the White's land, but then everyone was forced to leave a few years later. So this is what it looked like in 1899. You can see there's this creek that cuts all the way through the island that was called Deep Creek. Later, part of that was filled in, and it was only, cutting through part of the island. The shape of the island looks completely different on different maps because it was so low lying, and it was really victim to a lot of different marine and geological kind of forces like tides and currents. Sometimes there were many occasions when pieces of the island just sort of fell into Jamaica Bay, including whatever buildings were on those pieces of the island. So the island's shape is very different on different maps. And now you're going to get to see something that I only recently got my hands on. This is a 3D model of the island, and it shows it as it's labeled over on the left. It says Barren Island 1924 to 1935. This was made by a man named William Meyer, who was born on the island in 1917 and lived there until 1935. And when he was 94, he was interviewed by a park ranger because the land is now part of Gateway National Recreation Area. The National Park Service controls the land. So a National Park Service ranger interviewed Meyer about his memories, and he had an amazing memory. He shared so many detailed stories, and he referred to this model in the interview, and I was able to get a copy of the interview and transcribe it. And it was a really important part of my research, because one challenge in researching this book was that the voices of the islanders themselves were missing from most of the historical sources. Like most of the sources I was able to find were like newspaper articles written by a reporter who maybe visited Barren Island one time, or people writing letters to complain about how smelly Barren Island was, people who didn't live there. So I was constantly looking for what did the islanders think? And when I came across Willie Meyer's oral history, it was a huge gift to me as a researcher. I actually tried to find him at the time. I didn't know if he might still be alive. And I wasn't able to find him, but just a few weeks ago, his granddaughter contacted me, and we've been corresponding since then. And I asked her, because you can see sort of like a not very clear images of this model in the oral history video. And I said, does your family still have this? And she said, yes, it's at my aunt's house. And they sent me these photos, which are just beautiful. And nobody seemed, the key that he must have made to indicate what the numbers mean, nobody has right now, or it hasn't been found by the family. But you can see a lot of things listed. like the gun club, I don't know anything about. You can see the Flatbush Avenue extension. So it was extended from Avenue U all the way out to the island itself. You can see Floyd Bennett Field, which was built in the late 20s. You can see the Rizzo hangar. So Paul Rizzo was a self-taught pilot, which you can't do that anymore, I don't think. He was a self-taught pilot who built a little hangar on Barren Island before Floyd Bennett Field. And he and other pilots did sort of like these stunt flights, and islanders could pay a couple of bucks to like go up in a plane for a few minutes. Or they would parachute out onto Jamaica Bay. And Meyer told all these wonderful stories of the birth of the airport and what it was like in this sort of unregulated Wild West days of people flying all over the place and crashing everywhere. And he told all kinds of great stories, and that was super helpful. So I'm happy that I can share this photo, this beautiful photo of his model with you. You can see that obviously the Marine Parkway Bridge would be right here, but hadn't been built yet. So there are these piers that for the ferry between the Rockaways and Barren Island.
So it looks like Barren Island is both to the right and the left of the Flatbush Avenue extension?
Yeah, just a little bit to the left. I mean, that's where like Dead Horse Bay Beach is now.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yes, that's right. So now that you sort of have a bit of orientation of where it was, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what life was like on the island. So this is one of the factories. This photo was taken in 1897, and it was used in a big article that Scientific American did about garbage reduction, which basically just meant boiling garbage to extract grease, which could then be sold to industry. You can see this man standing on this piece of machinery over here. So this is one of the garbage factories. And this is a drawing from the same article. And basically, like, here's where the garbage is coming down this chute. The garbage is boiled at different levels and pressed, put under a lot of pressure to extract the grease. The grease would be sold all over the world. Ships would leave and take the grease wherever they could find factories to buy it. And then the remains that wasn't saleable would be incinerated. But before any of that happened, people would scavenge through the garbage. And so this black and white photo on the top is children scavenging on Barren Island, looking for basically recyclables like rags, metal, glass, things like that. And I read this only in one place, so I'm not 100% sure it's true, but what I read was that families would specialize in one particular type of material. Like one family maybe only collected metal, and they knew metal dealers that they could sell it to and make some extra money. So that's obviously a pretty dangerous job for kids to be doing. This picture on the right really struck me. This is from a New York Times article from just this past April 2020, and it's in Jakarta in Indonesia. And here's a scavenger scavenging through piles of garbage. And there are many, many people all over the world still scavenging in like really, really dangerous conditions in dumps, trying to make a living off of what other people have thrown away. So it just struck me how similar these pictures are, and they're separated by over 100 years. So in addition to the garbage processing, the other big industry was dead animal processing. I have not found any really wonderful photos of the dead horse factory, but this is one after I think it was already closed.
Yes, please.
Yes. Yeah, sorry, what was that? No?
Larry, if you can put it on mute, there's a button on the lower left. If you just click on that, if you're not talking, it'll be helpful.
So, you have to think of the late 1800s, early 1900s. There were thousands and thousands of horses in New York City. They died, and something had to be done with them. So the horse bodies were processed here along with dogs, and those were the main two animals. But any other sometimes they were given zoo animals to process. There was an alligator found in the sewer that was sent to Barren Island for processing. So they processed whatever kinds of dead animals, and I'll go into a bit more detail about that soon. And then the other big industry up until about 1900 was fish oil processing. So that was not a garbage related industry, but it was considered a nuisance industry because it was so smelly. They caught menhaden, and which is still the type of fish that's used for things like fish oil capsules. It's not really edible, but it's very oily and used in fertilizer, fish oil capsules, and other things. I have not come across any photos or drawings of the fish oil factories. They overfished the Menhaden, and then the industry shut down in this part of the East Coast. Now it's down further south. So this photo I just think is beautiful, and it kind of gives you a sense of how remote the island was. If you worked there, you had to live there. It was not possible to commute. Because the weather often made it impossible for boats to make the trip. So, and that could happen for weeks at a time, whether it was because Jamaica Bay was iced over, or it was too windy or stormy. So if you left, you didn't know when you'd be able to get back, and vice versa. So the community on the island had to be very self-sufficient. At first, it was just men living in company dorms, but very soon, that was like in the 1850s. By the 1870s, there were families living there, and they really had to learn how to fend for themselves. So some of the, there were very few public institutions. So this photo kind of is this sort of panorama, and I'll identify some of these buildings. So there was a public school starting in the 1880s, and later I'll talk about the original building that it was in. This building over here, this kind of big one with the water tower next to it, was the public school that was built in about 1900. Next to it is a smaller building that was the teacher's cottage. The teachers would come on Monday and sleep on the island until Friday, and then most of them would go back to mainland Brooklyn, if you will, for the weekend. The water tower is there because there was never running water on the island. Everybody depended on collecting rainwater or digging wells. There were various smokestacks from the factories that kind of appear in almost every picture because they're the tallest thing. This is, I'm not sure, honestly, if this is the Rizzo hangar that was on William Meyer's model or some other very small early hangar. And that's an airplane. It's a little hard to see that there. And this is the Protestant church, which was a very short-lived institution. So apart from the school and the Protestant and Catholic churches, there were really no institutions on the island. People had to just kind of work everything out for themselves. People kept gardens, people went fishing, they kept chickens, a few people had cows. And that was the only way really to get fresh food, right? Was to grow it or fish it or raise it yourself. Almost everyone who lived on the island was either a new immigrant or like the child of a new immigrant, or African American. And so the focus of my book is those people and their just sort of everyday lives at work, play, other aspects like education, crime. Basically, I just got really curious about what it was like to live in this really unusual place, especially at a time when many parts of New York City were so densely populated. I teach in the East Village, or what would have at the time been still considered part of the Lower East Side, which at the time was so incredibly overpopulated. And this is in New York City too, and it was like fresh air and almost like this rural village. So to me, I find it fascinating that some immigrants ended up in like very overcrowded tenements, and some immigrants from the very same backgrounds ended up on Barren Island. This is a closer up picture of the school, the 1900 school, and the teacher's cottage next to it. And you can kind of get a sense of this sort of scrubby landscape in a lot of these pictures. This is the Catholic Church, Sacred Heart. It was considered by the diocese to be a Polish church, so they always had a Polish-speaking priest there. There were resident priests for a few years, and the rest of the time the diocese would send priests over from other churches in Brooklyn. I was able to actually go to the archives of the diocese of the Brooklyn diocese and see like the marriage book and it was the marriage book and the baptism book. And that was really cool to see the handwritten records that the priests would keep of the different rites and rituals. So just kind of running through like a little bit more of the history before I read to you in more detail. So this is after the islanders had been evicted. By the mid 1930s, all those factories had shut down. There had been a lot of complaints about the garbage smells, which I'll tell you about, not from the islanders, but from people who lived in other communities nearby. There were really very few dead horses by the 1930s. Cars had taken the place of horses. So the horse factory shut down as well. And the island was no longer an island at this point. It had been filled in by landfill. It was connected to the rest of the city. Floyd Bennett Field had been built. And the islanders, and I'll explain in a moment why the islanders were then evicted. This is the opening of Floyd Bennett Field, which is kind of a shocking picture to see right now with all these unmasked people crowded together. And you can see the tiny little airplanes and the very many people in the crowd. It was a huge, big deal. It was the first municipal airport in the city. It ended up being kind of a failure commercially, but at the time it was like a really high tech, cutting edge kind of center of aviation.
1931, right?
I think that's right. It was right around then. I don't remember the exact year. I would have to look it up. They started building it in the late 20s. There were two different openings. There was when it sort of started functioning, and then there was the sort of official opening, which is this. And then there were the smokestacks became a problem because they were really an issue for the pilots. And so everyone decided the smokestacks had to come down. This was the last smokestack from the garbage factory. You can see this sort of like hollow shell of the animal factory here. And so it was blown up in 1936, and right around the same time, Robert Moses evicted the remaining residents. There were only about 400 people living there at that time because there really were no jobs left. No, I guess so he evicted everyone, and then the smokestack was demolished after that. It was partly because they were going to do this more elaborate marine park that never came to fruition, but also to build the bridge to the Rockies that he evicted everybody. So the buildings were then all demolished. And so the only thing you can see now, this is a picture I took just a couple of years ago, the only like structures that are still visible are these like remains of the piers from the ferries to the Rockaways. And these ferries didn't run for very long, as far as I can tell. It's only from when Flatbush Avenue was built out in the 20s until the bridge was built in 1937. But people did take the ferry to the Rockaways to go to the beach and so on. And other people would drive to Barren Island, park their car there, and then take the ferry. Excuse me. So, and if you've been to this is what we would now call Dead Horse Bay. If you've been there, you've heard about all the garbage on the beach on Dead Horse Bay. Most of it doesn't have anything to do with the garbage from Barren Island. The horse bones, yes, but all the other garbage on the beach is from a landfill that was like put there to kind of extend the land in the 1950s, and then it wasn't capped properly, and it's just sort of bursting up in slow motion from underneath the soil. So that garbage, if you go there and see old bottles, is not related to Barren Island. So now I'm going to read to you a bit from the book, and I'm going to start with the introduction. I could not find any photos of this event, but I did find this drawing from the Brooklyn Daily Eagle from around the same time. So you can see this woman, it looks barefoot actually, and a whole bunch of pigs, and you can see the factories belching smoke, smokestacks in the background. So this picture kind of goes with this story, even though it was drawn before this story happened. So this is how I start the book. One day in early March 1909, a New York City health inspector got on a boat at Canarsie Pier in Brooklyn and sailed to a place in that borough called Barren Island. In response to complaints from unspecified persons, he had come to find out who owned the more than 500 illicit hogs that roamed freely amid the sand, marsh plants, and garbage. It was legal to keep hogs in a pen, but not to let them roam. All of the islanders disclaimed any knowledge of the hogs, and presumably they assumed that was the end of the matter. But it was not. The 12 policemen of the health squad arrived by powerboat at 9 a.m. on Tuesday, March 16th, 1909, a few days after the inspector's visit, revealing not a hint of their purpose. And then these quotes are all from one article in the New York Times the following day. These strapping men were armed to the teeth, the New York Times reported, with revolvers and 200 rounds of ammunition apiece. Led by City Sanitary Superintendent Walter Bensell, they had a singular mission: kill all the unpenned hogs on Barren Island. They would need all the strength they had to accomplish their assignment. Soon after they disembarked, their quarry began to appear all around them. A shot rang out, and a big white hog rolled over on his back. From that moment, action was fast and furious. This is obviously from the newspaper article. As the police dispersed across the island, they quickly discovered that their task would not be easy. First of all, the enormous creatures often had to be shot multiple times before they would fall dead. More dauntingly, seemingly the entire female population of the island suddenly emerged from their homes to protect the very same hogs whom they'd claimed no knowledge of just days before. From the article, the women, few of whom could speak English, were crying and pleading with the policemen not to shoot the hogs, while between their sobs, they called what sounded like toy, 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 trying to get the rooters out of danger. Immune to this pleading, the brawny health police proceeded with their grim assignment. They strode across the sandy, roadless island, shooting every hog they could find, hogs of every description. From the article, some were so old and lazy they would hardly get out of the way when kicked, while others, long-legged, skinny, and shaggy as Shetland ponies, could give a deer the race of his life in a marathon. Although Barren Island's women presented the first line of defense, a number of men, quote, came from the factories to rescue their hogs, several picking up in their arms porkers which could not have weighed less than 150 pounds each, carrying them bodily into the houses through the front doors. In addition to the lucky hogs whose owners herded them into their homes, some others escaped into the nearby marshes. Several hours later, there were no more live hogs to be found outdoors. The policemen packed up their guns and headed back to the boat. Meanwhile, and this is the last quote from the article, those of the natives who were not engaged in dragging in the dead hogs preparatory to a great fry and roast last night were at their gates, shaking warning fingers and menacing fists at the policemen's broad backs. So I just thought that was a very vivid story that showed, first, like, keeping an unpenned hog had been illegal in New York City for like 70 years or something at that point. But the people on Barren Island were getting away with it because nobody really tended to pay any attention to them. Somehow this came to the attention of the authorities. The Barren Islanders just kind of ignored it until it became a real emergency because they were so used to being ignored. And that had its benefits and obviously a lot of costs, the fact that they were basically ignored by all of the civic authorities that they were ever found under or existed under. So I don't have very many photos of the factory, so you're going to see this one again. But I want to tell you a little bit about what went on in the factories because that was the whole reason why this community existed. Nobody really lived there before the factories came. It had been like grazing. I mean, archaeologists think that Native American people never lived on the island, probably because it was just so unstable. People would go there for like fishing and hunting and stuff, but there's no evidence that there were any like permanent settlements on the island of the local Lenape people. And the Dutch didn't live there either. Like people would graze animals there, but that was kind of about it. So the only reason this community existed was because of the factories. So I'll read to you a little bit about what went on there. The first factories on Barren Island in the 1840s or 50s undertook animal rendering, and the horse factory was also the last to go in 1934. By that time, the car had far overtaken the horse as a means of conveyance in New York City. But for many decades, thousands of horses a year were converted into a wide variety of products on Barren Island. Soon after the first factory on Barren Island opened, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle explained, "The head bones are ground up and sold to the gold refiners who make use of it for refining that precious metal. The ribs are converted into manure. The thigh, jaw, and hip bones are calcined and used for refining sugar. The shin bones are converted into buttons and umbrella handles. From the hoofs, Prussian blue is made, and from the flesh, prussiate of potash is manufactured. The clippings of the hides are boiled into glue. The hair of the manes and tails undergo the curling process and are used for stuffing mattresses. The remainder of the remains is converted into poudrette, which is powdered fertilizer. How were these remains prepared to be transformed into everything from umbrella handles to mattress stuffing? The same article summarized the process as follows. A dead horse is brought to Barren Island by boat and dumped on the dock. Thence it is carted to the vicinity of the factory and is divested of its hide. The body is quartered and the fat is carefully separated and placed in a receptacle for that purpose. The mane and tail are cut off and put in a separate place, and the flesh is soused, which means poured, into the large cauldrons for boiling. After this process, the remains are divided and placed in separate heaps: the head bones, the ribs, thigh, jaw, and hip bones, hoofs, flesh, clippings of the hides, hair, and manure. So the approach of this article is the same as virtually every other description of animal rendering on Barren Island. It's written in the passive voice, as if these processes took place by some sort of magic or automation. The horse is divested of its hide, not a professional skinner cuts the hide off the horse. Who did the divesting, the quartering, separating, and cutting? In reality, all of these tasks were performed by human beings who did very hard manual labor in hazardous conditions for at least 60 hours a week, often more. It's quite striking how consistent reporters and other visitors were in their explanations of these processes, almost entirely omitting the people who made them happen. To tell you a little bit more about those people and who they were and what kind of work different people did. So the people doing all this work were the male residents of Barren Island. As the population increased, occupations diversified somewhat and small retail shops emerged, but throughout the island's history, most of the men worked in the factories. Indeed, in 1877, a Brooklyn Daily Eagle reporter visited the island and found that with the exception of the hotel keeper, every person on the island is connected with the rendering establishment. So no other sort of economy ever developed there. The men were not distributed equally among the different jobs. Frederick R. Black analyzed 1880 census data for a National Park Service report and observed that at Coe's fertilizer factory, there were 31 white male laborers, 19 born in Germany, 5 in Ireland, and 7 in New York. While at John Jones's factory of fish oil works, there resided 45 laborers, all male, single, Black, and born in Virginia. These Black workers were supervised by 10 white managers. So this pattern of racial segmentation, with Black workers confined to lower level jobs at the fish factories, appears to have persisted until the decline of the fish oil industry in the late 1800s. An 1880 classified ad in the Sun announced, "Wanted 6 colored men to work at fish factory on Barren Island." A reporter who visited a fish factory in 1888 wrote, "Outside were great floors of wood where Negroes raked immense masses of dead fish back and forth under the hot sun till they were as dry as pieces of chips. They laughed and talked over their work and looked happy and contented. They came from Richmond, Virginia, and some of them had been at work on the island for 15 years. Reiterating this perception of Black workers as docile and submissive, another reporter wrote in 1894 of the Menhaden factories, the fish oil factories, "The factories are usually worked by colored hands brought on from Virginia. These men work for small pay and are steady and sober, never leaving the works until the season is ended, when they receive their pay and return to their homes in the South." And many of these men were probably born into slavery, depending on their age, probably most of them in the 1880s. So that the writing about the garbage factory is really similar to the writing about the animal factory, where all the people who did the work are rarely mentioned, except in these sort of slice of life articles. So people, the men worked in the factories, but people didn't work all of the time. And they had recreational activities as well. And some of the things they did were the same as any other New Yorker, and some were quite different. Here's one very unusual event. So you can see this headline says, "First auto trip on record to Barren Island." And the caption says, "The Maxwell truck and its escort driving over the ice on Jamaica Bay from Canarsie Shore." So this is, let me just find my page. This is in 1918, before Flatbush Avenue was built out. On January 27th, 1918, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle published an article about a surprising occurrence. Harold Rohde had driven a truck from Canarsie to Barren Island. The region was in the midst of a cold spell, and Jamaica Bay had frozen over. Rohde, who had, quote, large oyster and clam interests on Jamaica Bay, covered 5 miles over ice of unknown thickness. I mean, this was completely nuts, obviously, along with a friend driving a car. After driving through, quote, a tin can dump, seemingly millions of cans of all sorts and sizes, both truck and touring car went on through the little village, startling the animals and amazing the populace, of whom fully 90% had never seen an automobile. Rohde and friend gave the islanders rides and then drove back to Canarsie, with several islanders flying along behind after having attached their sleds to the vehicles. So this seems like it was a lot of fun for everyone, even though it was obviously incredibly dangerous. And to me, apart from it just being a fun story, this is 1918. Most of the islanders had never seen a car. 10 years later, there were like the most latest airplanes taking off from the exact same place. Like all of a sudden they were in the midst of like this really up-to-date technology just 10 years later. So that was obviously an unusual event, but they had more sort of ordinary pastimes as well. Fishing, of course, both for recreation and for providing food for their families. And I'm going to read to you a little bit from I have 2 oral histories. So William Meyer, who I mentioned before, and a woman named Josephine Smizaski, who lived there a little bit before Meyer in the earlier 1900s. So, and I've got that right here. Former residents Josephine Smizaski, who resided on the island from 1908 to 1918, and William Meyer from 1917 to 35, both fondly recalled swimming in the ocean and fishing for recreation. They also both remembered bonfires on the beach for Election Day and the 4th of July. The clamming, the rowboating, the fishing, oh, Meyer remembered. Just wandering around the island could be a satisfying form of recreation. My folks seemed to let me roam a lot, Meyer said. My mother always said, yeah, Willie, he loads up. He takes all my prunes and apricots and raisins and apples. He loads up and he's gone half the day. There were also many recreational activities, both for children and for adults, that were brought to the island and became part of residents' daily lives. Meyer remembered roller skating in the school basement in the evenings after Jane Shaw obtained a donation of roller skates for all the children. And think about it, there were no roads on the island. There was nothing paved, so you couldn't really roller skate out and about because it was just this sort of marshy, grassy area that wouldn't be good for roller skating. So they roller skated indoors in the school basement. Josephine Smizowski remembered the dance hall, which was also mentioned in several newspaper articles, sometimes as a site of immoral behavior. Children played sports. There was a baseball team. So this is a little hard to see, but it's a baseball game with the ubiquitous smokestack in the background. Meyer also remembered playing handball in the abandoned garbage factory buildings after that industry shut down in 1919. Sometimes kids just hung out and watched the world go by. After the Flatbush Avenue extension was built in 1926, Meyer said that he and his friends would watch the cars and quiz each other on the makes and models. Adults were enthusiastic visitors to taverns in the years before Prohibition began in 1920. After that era began, residents adapted. Meyer remembered his mother making home brew with hops and malt on the kitchen stove. His father would store the beer under the house in a cellar he dug himself, and, said Meyer, every once in a while you'd hear one of those sons of a gun explode. Another former resident, Edward Kishkill, remembered a weekly party, this is a quote, at the one building suitable for it, a tavern where a man named Mooney Zemzitsky banged on the piano, though he could not play a lick, while his brother played the clarinet. There were also more sedate pursuits for children and adults alike. Meyer remembered his mother visiting with other German immigrant mothers on the island, and his father would have friends over on Sunday afternoons, which was probably his only day off, to smoke Italian cigars. Meyer's father was a skinner in the horse factory, which was like the top job in the horse factory. Families listened to the radio, including prize fights, and he and other former residents recalled watching silent movies via electricity supplied only to the school, the teacher's cottage, and the janitor's house. Weddings were week-long celebrations in which every household cooked dishes, recalled Kishkill. Some residents raised homing pigeons. In general, Barren Islanders, said Meyer, were content to spend their evenings at home, keeping warm and feeding their children. This is another garbage factory photo. I love this one because it has this horse pulling this cart full of stuff. And this, you can see these buildings, well, I don't know if you can really see it, but these buildings are made of wood. And one issue that came up over and over was firefighting. The factories used steam. They had to heat things to a very high temperature. There was always the risk of, there were many scalding accidents, and sometimes people were killed from scalding, and there were often fires. The town of Flatlands never provided any fire protection, neither did the city of Brooklyn, neither did the city of New York. So they were using bucket brigades on Barren Island basically till the end, at a time when there was much more high-tech firefighting equipment elsewhere in the city. There were fireboats in Jamaica Bay, but they literally never ever got to Barren Island in time to put out a fire. So I'll read to you a little bit about this one really big fire. On May 20th, 1906. This came at a time when the island's population had grown and the factories were handling more garbage. The New York Sanitary Utilization Company's plant was completely destroyed, and the loss was reported as at least $1 million, which was quite a lot of money in 1906. The city took a bit more notice this time compared to previous fires, since the total garbage factory was destroyed. So they had literally no way to process garbage. So the city now had to just dump, or decided to just dump garbage at sea until the plant was rebuilt, which nobody liked doing. And the garbage would wash up on various beaches, and it was a mess. The local newspapers reported on the fire and its aftermath in several quite lengthy and prominently placed articles. As the Eagle observed, the flames spread with great rapidity, for there was a brisk wind blowing. The handicap was the lack of facilities for putting out the fires. And I'm just going to summarize a little bit of this in the interest of time. But basically, there was, of course, water everywhere. It's an island, but there was no water pressure. There was no way to really force the water through hoses. So hence the bucket brigades. At this point, the factories did have some internal firefighting equipment that they just privately bought, but it was nowhere near enough to handle this fire. They tried to summon a fireboat, but the fireboat had never been to Barren Island before and had to find a skilled pilot before attempting to enter Rockaway Inlet. So of course it didn't get there in time. This fire in particular was incredibly scary to the people who lived there. Barren Island was small and these huge buildings were aflame. So nobody knew if this would literally catch on to every single building on the island. So some people really, really freaked out. There was 1,200 barrels of oil exploded that, remember, they're rendering this garbage, and the animals also there's a lot of grease and oil to just be on fire and blow up. So according to the Tribune, several Polish laborers, maddened by the thought that they could not escape from the island, threw themselves into the bay and had to be rescued by boatmen. The newspaper made repeated references to the ethnic background of the laborers, perhaps implying that native-born Americans would not have reacted with such panic. Until the oil explosion, the foreigners employed on the island were kept together, said the newspaper, but afterwards they simply fell apart with fear. The New York Times also reported on the attempts of many, quote, Polish, Bohemian, and Italian islanders to escape, including one woman who fell into the bay and was scolded in Bohemian by her husband for losing their pet parrot and marble clock. The patronizing tone of this report is telling and is consistent with other remarks about the immigrant population. Most of the articles that talked about the people who lived on Barren Island were very patronizing and condescending. So I'm going to read to you a little bit more about the attitudes of outsiders. The biggest thing that outsiders knew about Barren Island was that it smelled bad. And nuisance complaints about Barren Island began to pile up in the late 1870s. Many of these were directed toward the New York State Board of Health and to the state legislature. And I went to Albany and read these thick books of complaints that they have from the State Board of Health archives. In response to these complaints, a number of laws were passed to attempt to force Barren Island factory owners to make their processes less smelly or close down. New Yorkers from off the island hailed the passage of each bill, as in 1899, when the World newspaper reported that the people who live in Brooklyn, Coney Island, Gravesend, Sheepshead Bay, Canarsie, Bergen Beach, Arverne, Edgemere, and the Rockaways can now rejoice that their nostrils will no longer be assailed by the powerful, putrid, pungent, penetrating, poisonous, prodigious odors that have arisen from Barren Island. Although this list of communities affected by the bill is quite lengthy, it omits any mention of Barren Island itself. So Brooklyn on that list just refers to the town of Brooklyn, what we would call Brooklyn Heights now. One is left to wonder whether the islanders would be rejoicing or not, but either way, they were not worth mentioning from the point of view of the World's reporter. This stance was typical of reports about the Barren Island odors and was consistent with smell-related concerns elsewhere in 19th century America. As historian Melanie A. Keachel writes of this time, seemingly no one cared what air industrial laborers breathed. Popular ideas about the lower classes, particularly immigrants and racial others, precisely the population of Barren Island, held that these coarser individuals did not notice or care about filth. Indeed, newspaper articles about the stenches usually did not make any mention whatsoever of the islanders. A representative example comes from the Brooklyn Daily Eagle of February 1st, 1881, which described factories, quote, in which the rendering of offal causes a terrible odor, which is a veritable plague to the residents of the country towns, especially in the summertime when their life is made unendurable. Similarly, on August 18, 1888, the Evening World reported about Barren Island with its bone-boiling nuisances, the odors from which have so long assailed the noses of those who seek fresh air and recreation at the various beaches nearby. So all the concern is for the beachgoers and the, summer recreationists on Coney Island and in the Rockaways and so on, who might have to smell these terrible smells. One other anecdote about the smells, which is just kind of a really interesting story, a short one. In 1879, the Eagle reported on a lawsuit in which an islander named Thomas Murphy sued the Broadway Railroad Company of the Eastern District after being thrown off a train because he allegedly smelled so bad. And in fact, this railroad company had made a specific rule that Barren Islanders could not ride on its trains. Murphy's challenge was unsuccessful. The jury, quote, rendered a verdict for the defendant. It was then decided that although the railway company is a common carrier, that constitutional obligation does not include the transportation of smells. So they were within their rights to ban Barren Islanders, according to that court decision. I want to tell you a little bit about crime and policing on the island. My sources for this were limited, mainly newspaper articles. I wasn't able to find police archives that went back that far, or court archives. And almost all the crimes that made the news were just bar fights, where maybe somebody got hurt badly enough that they had to be taken to a hospital in Canarsie or something. So up until Prohibition, and then that slowed down. So they often refer to these saloons as hotels, even if they weren't really hotels. This is Empire Hotel. I don't know if you can read the sign because it's pretty small, but it says Empire Hotel, famous Barren Island Roadhouse. Refreshments served, also dancing, free parking space, and then some kind of ice cream that's obscured by the building. So this photo, we can see telephone poles in this photo. So this is definitely from the later years of Barren Island, like almost all of the photos that I was able to find. So this is post-Prohibition. There were a lot of smaller saloons, like people would just turn a room of their house into like a little grocery store, a little saloon or something. That was pretty common as the population got bigger. There were, apart from the bar fights, there were other crimes that were more connected to the location and what was going on there. So in the early years, there were some very big distilleries that were raided by the tax authorities, not by the police, by the tax authorities, because these illegal distilleries were evading the alcohol taxes. Then the island got more populated. You couldn't really run a huge, gigantic illegal distillery there anymore. But later on, when the garbage factories were running, they had these arrangements with big hotels and like private clubs in Manhattan that had silverware that was like, inscribed with the insignia of that hotel. So I guess it's quite common for this stuff to accidentally get thrown out in the kitchen. And when that stuff arrived in the garbage at Barren Island, the factory owners agreed to basically collect it and ship it back to the Waldorf Astoria or wherever. So some workers got the bright idea that they could just intercept this stuff and sell it themselves to a silver dealer. And that happened a number of times. And in those cases, as far as I can tell, the islanders never were caught or prosecuted. It was the silver dealers who would get in trouble for buying this stuff. So that kind of crime is kind of unusual and unique to Barren Island. I'll read you one little anecdote from 1909, so before Prohibition, that is another example of how under the radar Barren Island was. A bartender named Stephen Gustney was at work in Joseph Simon's saloon one Sunday when policeman Isaac Van Houten saw a woman open the front door of the saloon, enter, obtain a can of beer, and depart. Since selling alcohol on Sunday was forbidden by law, Van Houten, the policeman, told Gustney to dress and go to the police station with him. The bartender was doubtful. He thought the policeman was jesting and laughingly told him so. Van Houten insisted that he was serious and took the increasingly bewildered Gustney to the station house in Canarsie by boat. When he was arraigned the next day, Gustney continued to insist that a mistake must have been made. He said, according to the reporter, he said he merely served beer on Sunday. He was indignant at the arrest. Who ever heard of a person being arrested for selling liquor at Barren Island before? Indeed, according to court records, such an arrest had not been made for 12 years. It was quite clear from Gustney's confusion that liquor had been routinely served on Sundays ever since then. Following his arrest, the police were instructed to keep an eye on Barren Island saloons on Sundays. So like they were just used to getting away with it the way they were used to having pigs running around, even though they knew it wasn't allowed, but they just took it for granted that this was never going to be, the authorities were never going to be interested. So the last, and they did have a policeman there living there for a while. They used to send police on shifts from Canarsie. Then they established a little tiny police station. They only had one resident policeman who lived there for a while, and that was after Prohibition had already started. So he didn't have much work to do. He was kind of on a break most of the time because there was very little crime at that point. So the last thing I want to tell you about is the school. I'm a teacher myself, so the stories about the school were always extra interesting to me. This drawing is from 1897, and you can see that the caption says, "The schoolhouse at Barren Island. At high tide, the building is surrounded by water. At low tide, the school stands in the center of a pestilence-breeding marsh. From the top floor, a typhoid fever patient was taken yesterday. He had been ill a week." So I'll tell you a little bit about what happened here. I mean, you can see this is just like a house, basically. It's just a normal house. So what happened was that in the fall of 1897, so this is in this sort of limbo time when like Flatlands became part of the city of Brooklyn in 1896 and then part of the city of New York in 1898. So this was during this very short period of time that the school was under the aegis of the Brooklyn Board of Education. In the fall of 1897, so you can see this is a two-story building, and the upper story was just like a residential apartment. And at the time, it was occupied by a tenant family named Otts or Otsage, depending on which newspaper you read. The father of this family became seriously ill, perhaps with typhoid fever or black or malignant diphtheria. Fearing contagion, Principal Spencer Wallace notified the Board of Health and was instructed to close the school. 2 Board of Health officials visited the island, and Wallace took full advantage of their visit and the interest of reporters to register a number of alarming complaints. He said there were other cases of illness on the island, although the visitors were unable to find them, and that very close to the school were filthy ponds filled with refuse from the fish and fertilizer factories. A visiting reporter described one such pond located 50 feet behind the schoolhouse. In this pool, pigs wallow to their heart's content, and refuse is dumped there without thought of removal, and the whole mass is left to decay under the sun. From it arises a smell that penetrates in all directions. This is before the pigs were rounded up. The school building was clearly on its last legs. The same article described it as follows. The schoolhouse itself stands on 6 piles of rotten wood. The structure is open at the bottom, although a feeble attempt has been made to board it up. It is a 2-story house, old and nearly fallen to pieces. The winds from the ocean have given it a slant, and Mr. Wallace, the teacher, is now unable to open the windows in the front of the schoolroom. The schoolroom occupies the whole floor downstairs and has a seating capacity for 30 scholars. At present, Mr. Wallace is crowding 56 into it every day that school opens. So it was really disaster. Did the Brooklyn Board of Education do anything about it? No, it did not. Then the island became part of New York City along with the rest of Brooklyn. So now it's under the New York City Board of Education. So in 1899, after that transition has been made, a new crisis occurred. So we remember Spencer Wallace was the principal and the only teacher at the school. As the Eagle reported tersely on February 25th, 1899, Spencer A. Wallace, principal of the Barren Island School, is in the custody of the police. An examination will be made as to his sanity. He was taken into custody while loitering in front of the Hotel Brandon on Lower Fulton Street. He said he was engaged in an important work, that of watching some conspirators who were trying to ruin the school system of Brooklyn. As suggested by reports in several other newspapers as well as the Eagle, Wallace had apparently suffered a mental breakdown after years working in intolerable conditions. Charles M. Chadwick, a school board member who took on a leadership role in responding to the situation, said that there was no doubt the collapse of the principal was due to his worriment over the condition of the school, especially after a recent blizzard that had damaged the building further. Chadwick attempted to visit Barren Island with the borough superintendent to investigate further, but perhaps fittingly, they were prevented from doing so because the bay was so rough that no tug captain would risk taking them over. As a result, officials had to rely on secondhand information as they tried to deal with the closed and deteriorating school. At the dock, Chadwick interviewed islanders who were also waiting for a boat to make the crossing. They reported in general that, quote, all the arrangements for the school were scandalously bad, and that even a well teacher would not have been able to manage. In Wallace's case, of late, he had been very irregular in holding sessions, often excusing the entire school after a few minutes' work without apparent reason. An islander quoted a bit later opined bluntly, he had probably been a good enough teacher in his day, but he was worn out when he came. You know, this is the dumping ground for worn out stuff, and anything is thought to be good enough for us. And that was really true in a lot of respects. So they did then build this new building, the one that I showed you before this one. And this took a couple of years actually. And in the interim, they held classes in like the Catholic Church and wherever they could find a place. So many children just didn't go to school. And then things got better, but there was still like a tremendous problem with absenteeism. A lot of times parents would prefer maybe that their children scavenge at the dump if they didn't feel like they were getting much of an education at school anyway. They could at least earn some money by scavenging. Then in 1918, a member of the New York City Board of Education suddenly took a big interest in the school. She heard that the school had been closed for weeks because the weather had been too bad and the ferry kept being canceled. So the teachers couldn't get to the island after they had gone home for the weekend. The school had just been closed. And this Board of Ed member she came to visit. She was probably the first visitor since that 1897 visit. And she found out how bad attendance was, and she decided like this was her mission to like improve conditions at the Barren Island School. And so she found Jane Shaw, who I told you before, who was a real go-getter, and who agreed to spend a year as the principal and ended up staying for the entire rest of the island's life, which was 18 years. She was really, I'm going to summarize a little bit. She was clearly like a real dynamo, and like the children loved her, the parents loved her, attendance shot up. And then for like years, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle used to publish the sort of top attendance schools as kind of like a congratulations. Barren Island School always had the top attendance every single month for many, many, many years because she was just very inspiring. And she, one thing she did, the school had mostly only ever gone to 7th grade. They rarely had an 8th grade. And so most of the kids were not able to go to high school, even if they found a way to get to a high school, because they hadn't had an 8th grade education. So she started just teaching the 8th grade herself because there was no budget to hire an 8th grade teacher. So on top of being the principal, she was the 8th grade teacher. She did things like have the kids, during World War I, there was peach pit collecting was kind of a big civic thing because they could use some chemical in the peach pits to, as part of an antidote to chlorine gas, they put it in gas masks. So she organized peach pit collecting among the kids. These are immigrant kids with immigrant parents. And so it was not just like a sort of community-minded thing to do, but she knew it would make the islanders look good and more like real Americans. And they gathered 20 bushels of peach pits. A Red Cross representative wrote them a letter thanking them and saying, when at the request of their principal, children will do work like this for their country, what splendid Americans we may look for as the boys and girls reach maturity. And so she really had a sense of like what would benefit the islanders. She also did a lot of work with the adults. She taught English classes. She got basic medical training and provided like first aid. She demanded that the Census Bureau come in 1930. They decided to just skip Barren Island until they heard from Jane Shaw, and she made them come. She gave cooking lessons. She got that big roller skate delivery. Like she just really worked very, very hard and came to really love the island and was very happy to stay. And then, make sure I'm not skipping anything important here. So at the end of the life of the island, when Robert Moses decided to just kick everyone out, he just posted signs around saying everyone has to leave in 2 weeks. And I think it was in March of 1936. And this land was owned by the city. People didn't have like, leases or whatever. Like it wasn't an eminent domain kind of thing like some of his evictions. It was simply, like a landlord evicting a tenant because the landlord wants the land for something else. And their local alderman got like a very short delay, but then Jane Shaw wrote a letter to Moses directly saying, basically, look, it's the middle of the spring. Could you at least let the kids finish the school year? And he changed the eviction date to the day after school ended. So the kids were able to, there were like 100 kids left in the school. They were able to finish that school year. Thanks to her. And so she then moved back to Brooklyn. She lived in Fort Greene, not far from where I live, and she died a few years later. And an obituary in the Brooklyn Eagle described her as the guardian angel of Barren Island. And another former resident said many years later to a New York Times reporter that she wasn't just a principal, she was a mother to everyone. So I find her very inspiring. So the island was coming to an end. This is just a nice drawing from one of the newspaper articles. The factories closed, the airport came, the island was connected to the mainland. It kind of passed out of existence. There is no more Barren Island. Most people forgot about it. And excuse me, when I found out about it, I just thought like, this is worth remembering. And so I want to conclude by sharing a couple of quotes from an article that is a pretty unusual one. As I mentioned before, most of the articles about the island kind of look down on these sort of primitive foreigners. But in this article in 1912, the reporter interviewed somebody who was just identified as a prominent worker. And the prominent worker said, well, I lost it. He said, everyone recognizes that this kind of work is important, but they're perfectly willing to let someone else do it and then look down on them for it, making a connection between the disgust for garbage and the disgust for garbage workers. He insisted that the people are the most industrious to be found anywhere. Everybody works and saves money. And he said Barren Islanders are better than a lot of folks, and they live better lives. There are about 1,000 people over here, which was actually, it was closer to 1,800 at the time. Mostly Poles, Russians, with a small percentage of Italians, Swedes, Germans, and other nationalities. All good folks, steady workers, and good citizens. The worker was frustrated with the constant misrepresentation by outsiders. How the idea got about that these people were different from the rest of the world is more than I can understand. And he understood that outsiders arrived for visits already prepared with stereotypes of what they thought they'd see. You will find a lot of things you don't expect to find over there, and you'll hardly ever find what you expect. So I just like those quotes and him standing up for his fellow islanders. And I agree with him that the islanders should have been respected and recognized for the important work that they did instead of being looked down on and pitied. So excuse me, sorry about all the coughing. That is, that's basically why I wrote the book, because I wanted people to know about these people and what they did, and that they were honorable people who should be remembered. And this is just the cover of the book. So I'm gonna stop the screen share. I can see that there's some questions.
Yeah, Miriam, before you
yeah, go ahead.
Could you maybe tell folks where they could pick up the book?
Well, you can certainly pick it up on Amazon, but you can also pick it up directly from the publisher, which is, I mean, I'm saying pick it up, but order. The publisher is the History Press, which is also part of Arcadia now. You can get it on bookshop.com or other like more independent. I mean, any bookstore will order it for you, I think. Yeah, so I'm just looking at the questions, and some of these are a number of people from Willie Meyer's family joined. So I'm really happy that you guys were able to come. And somebody asked why transportation was from Canarsie Pier and not from Coney Island. As I understand it, it's simply because it was the tides and the swampiness made it too iffy to travel from Coney Island, which is obviously closer. And that's my understanding of why, that it just was more, even though, as you heard, it was often, the ferry service from Canarsie was often shut down. Apparently it was still more consistent and more doable than Coney Island. And then there is some stuff in the Q&A. Was there a cemetery? No, there was not a cemetery. People were buried at churchyards in mainland Brooklyn. And I don't know if there wasn't a cemetery. My guess is that it was partly because the land was so swampy that it would have been hard to have a cemetery there. But I never found like anybody explicitly explaining why there wasn't, but there was not. And somebody asked why Barren Island. When did I first hear about it? I have had a longstanding interest in garbage, and I was doing a master's in history at Brooklyn College a few years ago. And so I started, when I needed a thesis topic, I read a book called The Fat of the Land. And I forget the subtitle is something like 200 Years of New York City Garbage. It's by a man named Benjamin Miller. And it has a few pages about Barren Island, and I just thought it was fascinating. And then I discovered that nobody had written like a full-length study before. Somebody else asked, did Barren Islanders settle in any particular parts of Brooklyn or Queens as they exited and the island residential community emptied out? I've been asked this before, and I wish I knew the answer. I think somebody would have to have time to like really dive deep into the census, and I just wasn't able to trace people. Like Willie Meyer's family bought a farm upstate and moved upstate. Josephine Smizaski, who's the other oral history I had, her family moved to Jersey City, where her father got a different factory job, I believe. So as far as I know, they didn't, the sort of dispersal of the residents happened over a period of time. Like by the time of the eviction, there were only 400 people still living there because people had left as the factories closed. In 1919 was the last garbage factory. In 1935 or 34 was the animal factory. So I've never come across any evidence that people kind of migrated together. So if they did, I don't know. Did the Navy use any part of Barren Island for military housing or other functions from Floyd Bennett? I remember flying into the Naval Air Station when I was in flight school on a flight from California. Yeah, as far as I know, it was the Naval Air Force Base, for World War II. And then afterwards, I think there were, I think there were like training flights and things. I don't remember the exact year that the whole, every last bit of air travel ended there. I mean, the LaGuardia kind of put an end to the commercial flights from Floyd Bennett Field. It was in 1942 that the last few people living on private land on the island were evicted. And then after World War II, it wasn't used very much. It became part of Gateway in the early 70s, and it was kind of derelict for quite a while, I believe, before that. The buildings, I mean, there still are buildings there from Floyd Bennett. Somebody wrote, I believe some of the Barren Islanders were buried in the graveyard in Canarsie. I'm sure that's true. Were the Black residents migrant workers? Yeah, I think that there was the earlier residents were migrant workers. I don't know exactly what the fishing season was, but yes, you're right. When whoever it was that asked, it said they would go back to Virginia after the season. So I believe, from what I can understand, that was the earliest Black workers who were living there at a time when it was mostly single men, whether white or Black. But there were definitely Black families later. Like, I do have all the censuses, the US censuses. I don't have all the New York State ones. And you can see, people are identified by race, of course. You can see a lot of Black families in addition to single Black men. So people definitely lived there long term. Although I've been in contact with some other descendants apart from Willie Meyer's family, but all of whom were white. I haven't been able to contact any Black descendants. Somebody from Willie Meyer's family wrote, I think I have a picture of the 3D map my dad built with the key attached. So I'm definitely interested in getting that. And Amanda Carr has my contact information. Is Floyd Bennett Field still used as an airport? No. It's part of Gateway National Recreation Area. So there's still a lot of the hangars are there. You can see some of the runways, but it's not an airport anymore. So I think that I answered.
A couple of questions that are on the answered section. You might want to look.
Oh, okay. Okay, I see. Was it a seasonal community? Yeah, so most of the time it was like a year-round community. It was only the garbage and animal rendering went on year-round. It was only the fish oil. There were ice houses there too, which I found a few references to, but couldn't find any more information about the people who worked in the ice houses, meaning, back in those days before refrigeration, in the winter, it was a job to go cut giant blocks of ice out of like lakes and places in the north and store them as well as possible, ship them to places that never had ice, like the southern United States or even further south, or store them in places around the north for use in the summer. And there was an ice house on Barren Island, but all I know is that there was an ice house. Like, they would list ice houses in the newspaper. So that obviously would be seasonal as well. But the garbage and animal factories, which are the main employers, were year-round. Did muckraking, okay, so somebody wrote, I'm thinking of Upton Sinclair's expose of the meatpacking industry in Chicago, The Jungle, published in 1906. Did any muckraking journalists in New York City write about Barren Island? No, I never came across anything. If they did, I haven't found it. I never came across anything where anyone expressed any concern about the safety of the workers. Like, there were articles about, like, a Polish laborer was scalded half to death at a Barren Island factory, but there was never anything in any of these reports that seemed to criticize the factory owners for any sort of negligence or to suggest that perhaps there should be laws to protect the safety of workers. I never came across anything like that. There were a few strikes, but not about safety issues. They were either about wages or about hours or about food. So as far as I can tell, there was no muckraking of that kind. How was U.S. mail handled on Barren Island? I actually have no idea. That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. People got mail, but I don't know how. There wasn't a post office. So I'm guessing that mail would get thrown on the boat, and whoever met the boat, with the dead horses on it or something, would probably distribute the mail. But I don't know. I never came across anything about that. And somebody else wrote, my grandparents lived year round.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I mean, I would suspect that these factories were put there because of its isolation.
Yes. So it was, Barren Island was kind of considered to be at first at least, like this perfect location where it was close enough to the city that you could bring the animals and the garbage there without too much trouble, but far enough away that the smell wasn't going to bother anybody. Because in the 1850s, there were very few people living, you know, in communities that the smell would reach.
Right, right,
Yeah.
right.
It was considered as a quarantine station numerous times, but for a quarantine station, it was always considered to be too far away from the city.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So you said 1,800 people lived there at the peak?
At the peak, yeah, I mean, that was in the 1910 census had the most people, and the printed reports I had read said 1,200, but I counted the census. I counted the numbers, and there were 1,800 people.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if anybody wants to get in touch with you, we had a number of people mention that they, you know, had information or had a family
Yeah.
member who was from there. How can they reach out to you?
I mean, I can just give people my email address. I'm fine with that. Somebody just wrote, my grandmother said there was a post office. So that would be something for me to try to find out more about, because I never came across anything about that. Is there, I mean, I can just screen share like an image of my email address. That's probably the easiest thing to do. Let me just do that. Great. Oops, sorry. Okay. Let me move this over. All right, I will screen share this. And, you know, Tom, I'm fine with you giving out my email address if anybody contacts you later. So this is, I'm easily reachable.
Yeah, and for some reason, somebody can't get through on this, or they'll write it down and want to get it later on, just reach out to me on my Casey McBride Gmail, at CaseyMcBride@gmail.com, that you all should have seen.
Yeah, I would love to hear from anyone who is connected. I mean, I'm happy to hear from anyone with any questions, but I especially am always very happy to hear from people whose family members were from Barren Island, because it just makes it much more real to me. I think I addressed the questions. Am I missing anything? I'll just look. Why is it presently below sea level? I don't think that it is. I mean, it's not underwater, so I'm not really sure what that, maybe I don't understand exactly sea level, but
I would think though that, you know, like when something like Hurricane Sandy hit, they must have been hit very hard there. You know, you mentioned that the island would, you know, change its definition. I'm sure the hurricanes were.
yeah, I mean, there's a lot of landfill there now, so it's not as low as it was back.
But back in the day, I'm sure if the hurricane.
Oh yeah, when there would have been weather like that then. Yeah, sorry, I misunderstood what you were saying. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I mean, I have any number of articles saying like a building from the white factory fell into Jamaica Bay after the storm last night. It happened quite a few times. Yeah. So I think I've responded to all the questions.
All right, well, I guess so. Well, listen, thank you very much, Miriam. That was really tremendous. We really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.